So let's get into this multiple episode video of Batman Beyond, covering episodes 4 to 7, starting off with episode 4. So this episode is titled Gollum. Why is that? Well, to give you a brief plot synopsis. At first glance, the episode seems like a basic story that a comic book might tell. Kid being bullied, and the bullied kid ends up being the villain, therefore showing the consequences of bullying. The Golem in the episode refers to a galvanic lifter machine, or a type of futuristic building technology android that can be controlled through a technological mind interface you can put on your head, that is usually meant to be used for construction purposes, that the bully's dad controls, and so the kid, or to give the character's actual name, Willie Watt, stole it and starts causing havoc on his bullies because he wants to get revenge because he feels like the bullying's too much. And it's really, really bad for him, basically. So at first glance, it looks quite basic. You know, kid gets bullied, literally Batman has to get involved because it gets out of hand and has to fight the Golem. So at first glance, quite a basic episode that comic book media is probably retold with villains God knows how many times, and now it's just being adapted into a Batman animated episode. And the lesson's going to be that bullying is bad because it can lead to horrible instances. However, the themes go deeper than this. In the episode, the bullies never learn their lesson, which means there's like 2 or 3 attacks within the episode, both of which get progressively worse in vengeance, causing the kid to just get more and more angry and upset because the bullying just doesn't stop. Nobody learns their lesson, therefore the instances get worse. Also, you find out that as the bullies are taking out like aggression on him and using him as an embarrassing punching bag / embarrassing him for the sake of clout with shallow high school girls, but his father is also obsessed with toxic masculine traits and telling him to be a man up, and, you know, quite quick to rage. So it's showing that not just bullying can push this, but family members not being understanding, empathetic, and actually being balanced in their rage as an adult can really have effect on kids as well. So the themes really do go to a deeper level. And those themes get paid off as well, because when the final fight scene happens and Willie has actually progressed with the controlling of the Golem to the point where he doesn't need the headset, he's got a sort of a telekinetic link with it, so he can control it even more and even easier than before and use weapons such as, I think it was a flamethrower, to just go absolutely all out, which is a really cool fight scene. The fight scenes in this episode are great. But I think that's in the final fight scene. He actually goes after his dad, because when his dad is trying to say, what the hell are you doing? What the hell are you doing? You're going to put these kids in danger. It's going to go horribly wrong. How can you be the one doing this? Like, the father can't even understand it. And he just says, well, I'm being a man. Which one of us is tougher now, Dad? And when his dad is trying to say, stop this right now, and gets aggressive to stop him rather than trying to be understanding, it just leads to Willie Watt going after his dad. And it just seems really, really tragic. And again, the themes seem really deep, and it shows all sides of the coin. It's not just bullying at school, but bullying at home or aggression at home can really, really affect kids. And it's a really tragic story, and you really do end up sympathizing or empathizing with the villain, in my opinion. So props to the writers, because they really seem to write either really interesting villains with really interesting power sets, or really empathetic villains, or a mix of the two. And I can't think of a villain from any of the episodes thus far that either hasn't been really interesting for the characters to go up against, or genuinely empathetic, and Willie might be the top genuinely empathetic villain of the lot in episode 4 here. So if you can't tell, I think this episode is great and has really deep themes that, yes, are executed within a 20-minute time frame, yes, have to be executed at a somewhat base level, so the kids don't read into it too much one way or get too scared the other, but it still doesn't hold back, it doesn't pull any punches, and the animation and fight scenes with the Golem are really interesting. Terry being tied to the high school and so having a bit of a stake in all this and knowing the situation in the high school, seeing the situation with the dad when the final fight happens, and Willie actually turns on the dad as well because he just can't understand why his father is still yelling at him. It's really, you know, close to home for Terry, and it's really compelling to watch. And so yeah, as I say, it has to be somewhat not too explorative in themes because it's a kid show, but it's still really deep and gives an extra layer of interest and draws you in watching it as an adult, at least that's what I think. But that's all I've got to say about this episode. No real criticisms here. Perhaps it's nostalgia goggles, perhaps not. What do you think? Do you agree with me? Comment below and let me know. Batman Beyond, Episode 5. This is the episode where Mr. Freeze returns. And whoa, what a heavy-hitting return it is. There's so much to go over in a 22-minute runtime, but I'll try and make it as brief as possible. Anyway, just general thoughts on this episode. It's so empathetic and hard-hitting. Even as a kid, because I don't know about you, but I always felt that the way Bruce wasn't very forgiving was just so cold, no pun intended, and the fact that he was literally living in a jar as a floating, frozen head, medically preserved, was just punishment enough, regardless of what his crimes were. And he said he hasn't really moved, or aged, or eaten, or slept properly as a man would in like nearly 50 years. And it's just, oh, it's so hard-hitting. I'm sure it's even more hard-hitting if you've seen Batman the Animated Series, which I haven't, and will one day cover, review in some fashion on this channel when I do see it for the first time. But it's just so, even as a kid I was like, wow, this is deep already, and this is the opening bit. So why did Freeze return? Well, basically, Blight wants a new body due to what Powers has done to himself, due to Terry's chemical shenanigans when he basically tried to defend against Powers in the first episode, so tries to prove he can give a mind a new body by first testing it on Freeze rather than his own damaged DNA, because that would mean death if done wrong. But of course, Powers, as Wayne Powers, philanthropist, can try and, make it a PR move at the same time. So that's the basic reason why Mr. Freeze gets to return, and why we see what his sad fate has been for the last 50 years. And as I say, generally speaking, it's so empathetic and so hard-hitting, because being stuck like that was just generally just punishment enough. Overall, the things that stood out to me in this episode was the writers did a fantastic job in showing villains to be empathetic overall throughout the last few episodes I've covered, as I've talked about in pretty much all my recent videos for one reason or another, apart from perhaps Powers and what happened to him. But overall, they did a really good job of making empathetic villains, and you can understand why they took the paths they did. You can even understand more so now than you did as a kid, and it's really, as I say, hard-hitting, and they wrote a lot of empathetic villains on occasion for this show, especially for the first season. But I think that Mr. Freeze is generally the epitome of that, because it's an old enemy, and you've seen him, well, I mean, I haven't yet, but most of Batman Beyond's fans have seen this character's progression and storyline and story arc and villainous motives throughout BTAS or Batman the Animated Series. So seeing the results of that after 50 years is just mind-boggling, that's in continuity, how long he spent, and what type of person he is now because of it. This was my first introduction to Mr. Freeze in any kind of medium, and damn did it stick with me. And this version of the character, and this kind of origin with his wife, and the origin of Mr. Freeze, has been used in other medium. If not, it's kind of the default medium. It's kind of the default origin that's used across mediums now, and you can see why, because the writers did a fantastic job from Batman the Animated Series to Batman Beyond with this character's general arc and what ends up happening to him. And as a first introduction, this damn well stuck with me, gave me some memories, and always made me like the character and empathise with the villain, no matter what version of him I'm watching on screen. But yeah, I think Mr. Freeze is the general epitome and peak of empathetic villains on Batman Beyond. And his story overall as an ending in this episode is so sad, yet understanding, like you can understand every action he takes. And it feels like a completely natural way to bring Mr. Freeze's morality to an end. Generally speaking, other things that stood out in this episode was the fight sequence between Blight and Mr. Freeze, and the general fight sequence that led to with Terry and Bruce worried about Terry facing off against Blight. That general fight sequence, those small and then led into other fight sequences. That plot beat was amazingly well done towards the end, and it's just brilliant sort of proper villainous introduction for Blight and how dangerous he was to have those two face off, and it works so well in my opinion. Generally speaking, as I said, I as a kid I drew attention to the fact that Bruce was not very forgiving, and I generally loved that for his character watching it as an adult now. I like that Bruce is not very forgiving. It shows just how it is for Bruce and how he's become old and jaded in his old age, and how much he would still love to be the guardian against criminals in Gotham City, particularly old enemies, and still be Batman and still fight old enemies, but that he just can't. You really get the sense of that in this episode, just like you did with the poignant 5-minute beginning opening scene in Batman Beyond in the first place, and you really carry on that sense of emotion here, or rather lack of emotion and general bitterness and stoicism that Bruce is hiding behind. The episode in general, another thing that stood out to me, this is perhaps the second best growth point of the season between Terry and Bruce's relationship, as at the end of the episode, with all the events that transpired, he admits that they both might have been right about Freeze's intentions when he said things like, he's just a criminal living for revenge, when Bruce said that, versus when Terry said he's a guy trying to get his house in order. Bruce kind of admits by the end that they both might have been right, and it might have been somewhere in the middle, and Bruce kind of says, we were both right, but also somewhat both wrong. So this kind of plot interaction between Terry and Bruce in this entire episode kind of ensures that Bruce is being influenced and changed by Terry, and their relationship is growing. And as I say, in terms of moments for their relationship, this one is definitely top tier and definitely the second best growth moment of the season for me. When I get to the episode that I believe is the first best growth moment, I will touch on that as well, but it wasn't in this episode. Some people may disagree with me there. Continuing the topic of other things that generally stood out in this episode, although the episode itself was generally a masterpiece in my opinion, and I don't really have any criticisms, maybe nostalgia goals there, but I just think this episode was so well done, even as a first introduction to Mr. Freeze, and I don't have the context of the animated series. But anyway, back on task to other things I want to talk about that really stood out in this episode, even with all that greatness. Some of the really good lines that just stood out in this episode, Blight basically talking to Terry, or I should say Batman Beyond, about his own picked name. I am a blight upon the land, and everything I touch shall wither and die, and then he sort of pierces and damages Mr. Freeze to demonstrate that. And when Bruce is talking about Mr. Freeze, and Terry and Bruce are having a first kind of interaction about Bruce's feelings towards him, and he says, my parents and my family and me kind of think that it's just a guy trying to get his house in order. Bruce's response is just very coldly, and looking directly at Terry saying, it's a cold draft that blows through that house. And I'm not even going to try and voice act it, and because I will butcher the late great Kevin Conroy's work, but it was such a poignant line, so great, and again shows just how Bruce is in his old age. And shows Terry more about Bruce as well, I think. And that line, along with other scenes in this episode, just show so well that two natures are at war in Freeze, that he might be someone who lives for revenge, and there might be bitterness there, but he is trying to be different, trying to be better. And you see that mostly in one scene that really stands out. And you see that really well in one scene that particularly stands out in this episode, and that's when a gentleman tries to kill the newly reincarnated Victor Freeze in his new body when he's at the grave of his former wife, and he tries to take him down, and Batman interferes and says, we'll take him to the police, whilst the regular citizen is just crying, he's got to die, the monster's got to die. So you see that you see the effects of Freeze's damage when he essentially destroyed this man's family, and you see that he does generally regret his actions, and it's just a very small but very poignant scene where you sort of reflect back on what Freeze's motives were in this continuity, that he was doing all this for his wife, and he is a good man, and there are, in effect, two natures are at war at Freeze. I will do anything to save my wife, but I am an empathetic and kind man, and I do regret the actions I took to do that, because it was the actions of a desperate man. after 50 years of brooding on all this, he does regret what he did, and he does understand why he did it, but also understands he shouldn't have done. So it's Two Natures Are at War thing is really shown off well, and it's just so poignant to me. He even says that he's done the man enough damage, and says that he will not go to the police, and just lets them go. And Batman Beyond, or I should say Terry, is shocked by that, because it shows that, again, it goes back to Bruce and him having the conversation at the end and saying that they were both right and both somewhat wrong. Anyway, a funny moment that stood out in this episode before I move on to my final thoughts, actually, are that Freeze is that Victor Freeze also tries to make the Nora Freeze Foundation after his former wife, that was almost certainly, if not indefinitely, hidden away in an account for 50 years, accruing quite a tidy sum for a charity startup position, however, was almost certainly, if not indefinitely, accrued by stolen funds, which I just found really funny, because, that's definitely blood money, as Bruce puts it, and it's amazing that the American business system, or at least this episode, is allowing him to do that, and it's definitely done by illegal funds, and I just find that really, really funny. But then, of course, the character lineage of Victor Freeze in this continuity comes to an end when Mr. Freeze essentially understands what Blight was really doing to him, and that he's going to try and biopsy Freeze's organs, breaks out, keeps a machine in cold storage for revenge, all of the ice puns, and it ends in a fight sequence between Freeze and Blight, with Blight damaging his suit, and also trying to initially cause a meltdown to allow himself to be put to rest and be destroyed, but also taking thousands of innocent civilians with him as well, if this meltdown was successful. So Batman stops it, and Freeze agrees to attempt to ensure the damage is as minimal as possible, but still allows the building to go down, because he does want this to end, because he either thinks that I'll be in prison or stuck in a relatively similar form for another 50 years, and I've had enough of this. So it's such a bittersweet yet understandable end for Freeze, and it's just, to me, it brilliantly tailed off his character as a kid. I don't know if I can really say that without seeing the context of Batman the Animated Series, but it was definitely a poignant and tearful, understanding, so mixed emotional end, and I found it a brilliant end as a kid. And maybe when I go back and review Batman the Animated Series after I've reviewed Batman Beyond, I will feel differently, or maybe I'll feel the same. But how do you guys feel about this ending? How did you guys feel about this episode? Let me know in the comments below if you wish. This will be Batman Beyond Episode 6 review, so here we go. This episode review covers, as previously stated, Season 1, Episode 6, titled Heroes. For any of you that don't remember the episode from the title, this episode is essentially where the Terrific Trio shows up, which is hilarious to me because the Terrific Trio are essentially a trio of superheroes that are essentially a rip-off of the Fantastic Four, but the tragedy stems from a more relatable source, and is arguably a lot darker themed and a lot more explored than it was in any Fantastic Four comics I read as a kid, personally anyway, and from what I briefly remember of my brief but not very much watching of the Fantastic Four animated series. Obviously tragedy was explored in that too, but in this one episode it just oozes tragedy. That sounds a bit weird, but you hopefully get what I mean by that phrasing. But let's get into it. The Terrific Trio, as I said, stems from a related source of tragedy, and that's how they get their powers. It's such a dark episode with such dark themes covered so well, but it feels... And it was kind of a shock watching this episode as an adult. It feels like such a different episode versus when I watched it when I was a kid. The pain of the two lovers, Michael and the woman who can freeze people, essentially, who's a ghost of icy mist, whose name I've forgotten. I think it's Freeze-On, or something really daft. They don't spend too much time on the names, I don't think. But yeah, they're two lovers that are unable to touch each other because Michael's powers are just too too powerful heat powers, and obviously he looks just like a walking lava monster, and he can't touch anything. As the Doctor says in the episode, you can't even touch a test tube without melting it, Michael. So you can really see the pain on their face. And essentially the realization at the end, obviously spoilers for the episode, that what's doing this to them, what's slowly killing them, what's keeping two lovers apart and ruining three friends' lives is a friend's jealousy, is essentially slowly killing them, in that the Doctor's jealousy is essentially what did this to them. This is all his fault, and even further shock and horror comes when you see the presumed deaths in animation of these characters, because Terry has to stop them from essentially realising the horrible truth, realising the accident that was caused wasn't an accident and it was done intentionally because the Doctor believed that the women wouldn't, that the woman of the trio wouldn't be there and that he would have a chance if Michael was out of the way. That being not the case at all. But it really shows what jealousy can really do, and that their friend's jealousy, as I say, is slowly killing them. And again, is emphasised by the deaths at the end. You could say that this is too... that the deaths are emphasised in a way that you could argue they were just temporarily dispatched and defeated. But I mean, I remember the imagery as a kid, and even more so it's hard-hitting as an adult, of the woman who's essentially just icy mist getting sucked up into the ceiling fan, and that's just... Jesus, that was terrifying. She wasn't dead from that. Whoa. That's a painful end, and surely they would have come back if they weren't. And I think they were going for a death scene, because it was just kind of like... The Doctor even says at the end, you don't understand, I was their friend. And for those of you that would argue, Batman Beyond and Terry could have avoided it and Batman doesn't kill and all that thing, you could argue it was unavoidable because this is early in his career and he's trying to fight three superpowered superheroes that have just lost everything and don't care about holding back anymore. Therefore he had no choice, because it was a fight the three superheroes, or see the building and potentially other scientific chemicals and dangers go up in smoke, causing damage not just to the Doctor but everyone else, replicating the accident, because they just don't care anymore. So it was just, they didn't really have much of a choice in what he did. And just the darkness that must have been inside the Doctor to be driven to this level of madness and revenge, it does really give you pause for thought as an adult. And the death scenes, or implied death scenes, are even more difficult to watch, because you can just tell that they so wanted to be heroes, even in their difficult state, and regardless of all the difficulty that happened to them, they were really trying to live up to the epitome of superheroes, but the tragic backstory of superheroes was what did them in, and their friends' jealousy was what did them in. I'm sorry, I'm kind of gushing over this episode really quickly and talking really fast with a massive smile on my face. It's just because this was so dark, but equally so well written, that I can't criticise it. And you can argue it's the nostalgia goggles in my case, but every time I watch this episode I am awed by the themes I pick up on it from an adult, and the amount of tangents I could go on discussing it versus me watching it as a kid and not really picking up on as much of this. But I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you guys think this wasn't as big of an episode? Do you think the parody of the Triffica Trio versus the Fantastic Four and the tragedy wasn't as well done? Do you think that it just, wasn't as big a deal or as good of an episode as I'm painting it to be? But personally, I think it was pretty good. I also liked the idea of Terry's little brother Matt, when he sees the footage on the news of what happened to them. It's this is not suitable for children, and just him and his friend going, cool, and leaning right next to the TV, because that's just what a kid would do, isn't it? It's just stupid, but it's funny to see. There was a similar story of a deception driving heroes mad in Justice League Unlimited, but I'll probably eventually cover that show on this channel, so I won't go too much into the parallels. But it would be interesting to me. I don't know who the writing team was for this episode. If they were a similar writing team, then I can see why the ideas overlapped, but they still seemed similar but not formulaic, and distinctly different enough to give me different emotions while watching the episodes, even though their themes at their bare-boned levels when written down on paper are probably essentially concisely the same. But I wonder what you guys think of those parallels as well, so tell me in the comments if you'd like to. And but the episode itself, is the point of what I'm trying to say, is the episode still stands out uniquely, especially because of the death earlier on in the episode as well, and the death at the end. Terry's reaction to it when he says, no, you don't understand, I was their friend, and he just leaves him chained up for the police and just goes, sure you were, and it's just like, yeah, I have no sympathy for you, mate. If it weren't for the damage these guys posed, he probably would have just been like, if I wasn't Batman, I would have just left you. But yeah, you can really hear it in his voice, and Will Fowdy, I believe that's how you pronounce Terry's voice actor's name, does a brilliant job voice acting in this episode. There's also an earlier death because the Freon character, which I believe is the ghost made of chilled mist, basically, that couldn't touch her male partner and couldn't touch Michael, killed a person by freezing them to death while trying to rescue people. Like, I mean, the other ones, it looked like she froze in a way where they could survive, but there was one where I'm like, is that guy dead? So it was very dark even before then, and potentially foreshadowed the dark scenes and the kind of pseudo, was it a death scene, wasn't it a death scene question. But yeah, this was a really dark, but also really, like, satisfying episode because it made you pause for thought, and it showed how brilliant animation, whether it be kids animation or a general animated film, could be, and how much animation could make you think. And these kind of episodes are really, like, I'm noticing going through the season how many of these episodes and how well villains or twisted motivations are written by these writers. And these kind of episodes I just don't see in modern animation anymore. Maybe that's nostalgia goggles. And there are some animated films, like the Spider-Verse films, for example, that really do push the boundaries of what animation can do, could do, will do, and show, as it needs to be respected as a medium, and you can write something that's for kids, but also really dark and meaningful and deep and meaningful, whether it be dark or not. And yeah, it's so well done, and I don't think that kid shows, or especially DC's kid shows, which I'll occasionally watch because I like DC animation, and DC animation, I think they don't do it as well as they used to. Again, that could be nostalgia goggles. Do you think I'm overpraising this episode? Do you agree with me? Do you think the implied death scenes and the darkness and the foreshadowing worked really well for you? Do you disagree? Comment below and let me know if you want. And now we're on episode 7, I believe. That's going to be embarrassing if I'm wrong. And this episode is the episode and debut of Shreve as a villain, when Powers essentially hires Shreve to try and end Bruce Wayne as a issue for Wayne Powers and his business interests and all that. But let's get into it. Interesting thing to note this episode is that the villain, as in Shreve, doesn't seem to come across as an emotionally or intentionally tragic, or at least as emotionally and intentionally tragic as some of the other villains have done in more recent episodes I reviewed. However, you can definitely still see the no option or no choice side to it. And though it's not as emotionally, sympathetic or empathetic with Shreve's backstory and villain origin here, I do think it does work to the episode's advantage because it shows how Powers is essentially taking over his company, causing him to basically go bankrupt and evidently starting him down a villainous path of becoming a hitman and essentially ruining his life with what happens to him by the end of the episode, and ruining his life in further episodes, starting a rivalry with Batman. Just reminiscing from memory, that this villain's arc in the series is a really, emotionally difficult one, still sympathetic one, even if it's not intentionally as tragic when he starts out as some of the other villains I've reviewed. And it's really fun to watch them write these characters with ranging emotions, and they feel more like real people than some modern writers write with certain series and things, to be fair. They do generally feel real, and you can definitely see the no choice, and you can see the side of why Batman is needed in Gotham. You can see the side of why the criminals are more sympathetic than, say, some, not all, because there are definitely some standouts from what I've heard, but some of the criminals from Batman the Animated Series weren't sympathetic, they were just mental, whereas the writers seem to really like writing villains that do feel like there's two sides to every coin when it comes to criminality. Whether you empathise with that in real life is up to you, and that's not the debate we're having here, but that's how the episodes, as in Batman Beyond Season 1, seem to frame most of their villains, and it's all to their advantage, in my opinion. And it shows just how powerful Powers is in a really subtle way. It shows how his mind works. Other scenes with Powers' voice actor that did a brilliant job in this episode, by the way, was when he sort of goads Terry into essentially insulting him in front of witnesses. Thankfully, it's prevented, but he's fully willing to goad him into it because he knows in a court of law the legal system would side with the rich guy that can pay for a team of lawyers and not Terry, who to all outward appearances is just Bruce Wayne's assistant. Obviously Bruce ends up in hospital in this episode, and speaking of voice actors that did a really, really great job, not to take anything away from Will Fowdy as Terry McGinnis, because he's doing a constantly great job in these episodes, but Kevin Conroy did a great job of showing not just how he is as Batman, but showing how he is as Old Man Bruce Wayne. Obviously that's his main role in the series, so people might think I'm overstating this, but no, I don't think I am when it comes to this specific episode. Like, genuinely, Bruce goes through a time when the voices first start where I think he's tempted to listen to the voices and tells them to get out of his head out of frustration, because he can't tell whether they're real effects of his psyche or not to begin with, and that's a harrowing thought. But I think that is framed intentionally because Bruce knows how psychologically messed up he is. He knows that he's basically hiding behind a mask of trauma. He knows that Old Man Bruce Wayne, the businessman, is just a mask. He knows that Batman is the real thing, and he's worried that one day he's not going to come back because, and that worry doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not alien to him to understand his psyche, but still give in to patterns of behaviour, because frankly we all do that. Addicts do that. Everyone does it. There's patterns of behaviour we say we can't change. Perhaps we should work more to change them, but it makes perfect human sense that someone would be aware of something but feel like they couldn't stop themselves. It's not alien as a concept for humans to understand. Maybe as a kid I didn't understand that to that level, but as an adult, man, it really hits home, and that's why I keep coming back to these episodes and watching them as an adult, because they're not just fun, they are incredibly well written, and there are so many messages and things you could take from them. Like, I'm reviewing this now and giving you my take. People might think entirely differently about Bruce's psyche than I do, and that still could be equally valid, and that's why debating these episodes as fans, the comment section of these videos, is something that I will always come back to read and to check on, because I think that people can really have an interesting point of view on the DCAU from Batman's perspective. Others as well, but definitely Batman's. But that just shows the strength of the writing. Yeah, I think that was a really good way of framing it where the voices started off, and I had a really good way of framing it where the voices ended, where it was essentially the voices kept calling me Bruce, and in my mind that's not what I called myself. And then Terry goes, but that's my name now, and it just works so well. It brings everything full circle, shows that Bruce has still got it as a detective. Speaking of got it as a detective, this was Terry's first attempt at playing detective by himself. Didn't go perfectly, but it was still really cool, really fun to see, and gave Terry's character more development in a way that I think people have been clamouring for up to this point, and the development still feels good, not rushed, and quite natural. And I think that's something with Terry's character that you can almost see almost completely throughout the series, that his development does feel natural. The development of Bruce and Terry's relationship consistently feels natural. The development of Old Man Bruce and giving you a different perspective on the wouldn't it be great to be Batman argument feels harrowing but natural to a kid, and interesting what you can take from it as an adult. The other scene I want to talk about, so yeah, I'm rambling, so I will try and wrap this up quickly, but the other scene I want to talk about, where he takes Terry to the theatre, where Shreve obviously first tries to essentially remove Bruce Wayne as an obstacle and get rid of him completely, for good. But Bruce is talking about how, I think it's Gotham's Historical Council is trying to preserve the area, and it's like, wow, I think you'd want it to be torn down. And he looks around at, say, the poster of the Joker, showing how much, just from an animation look, how much, the Joker has left a stain on his life, and how big of a villain he was. Just seeing a poster of him, does ignite something in Bruce's eyes. And you see why further down the line, but I'll get to that specific feature film when I get to it. But And the point I'm trying to make with this theatre scene that I'm gushing over and not explaining very well is a really potent scene between Terry and Bruce, because like, do you want to forget what happened to your father? And then they both have a sort of look of acknowledgement and then a look of mutual understanding of, yeah, we both come from different worlds but are cut from the same cloth as far as Masks of Trauma is concerned, and I fully understand and empathise. And that's just a really cool scene, and then obviously the action kicks off, which adds to it and then brings us into the hospital, and brings us into the voices, the psychic exploration, and Terry's first run of playing detective. So this episode is really wrapped up well together. No moment of writing is wasted, and there are some really potent scenes emotionally setting us up, and the emotional through lines go off in all kinds of really engaging emotional directions that you can genuinely continue to watch all day, because the grittiness, the layers are there, and it's fantastically well done. I hope you guys don't mind these reviews. I hope you guys don't think that I'm just gushing over episodes. But genuinely, I think the writing of villains of the episodes is core to this series, and the writing of villains continues to be mostly consistent, and they're not perfect, don't get me wrong, there are things I could criticise, but the good far outshines the bad, so I spend time gushing over the good rather than thinking of the bad. And this episode, personally, I really enjoy every time I come back to it, so I guess there is nostalgia goggles as well. So then, guys, that was Batman Beyond, episodes 4 to 7 of Season 1, and you'll be happy to know the video is almost over. You can soon go. But before you do, if you like this kind of content, you want me to keep covering Batman Beyond Season 1 and finish it off in some fashion, or other DC animated shows like Superman, Batman the Animated Series, etc., and you want to stick around for other videos like The Penguin, then like the video, so I know you like the content we're throwing up, consider subscribing, throw a comment in there if you've got suggestions you want me to review. But if you've stuck with me this long, thank you for sticking with this such a long video. I hope you enjoyed it. But that's the end of the video, guys. You'll be thrilled to know that you can finally go now.